How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Baking World Tour. Today we're making Bosnian Somun and Ćevapi. Somun is the flatbread. It's quite similar to pita, and Ćevapi are like little mini kebabs. It's all served up with sour cream sauce and some fresh onions. And all combined, it makes for an amazing meat lover's meal. This kind of food is popular across the Balkans, but Bosnia was first on the list. And it is so easy to make all of this. And I'll show you a couple of good tips and tricks along the way, so let's get to it. Here's what we need. For the dough, some strong white bread flour, water, yeast and salt. For the ćevapis, we use some ground beef, ground pork, some stale bread. This is a key ingredient. It's an old grandma trick, but it works perfectly, and I'll show you in a minute. And for the meat, we'll also need an egg, some crushed garlic, paprika, pepper and salt. Sour cream for the sauce, some herbs, I'm using chives, salt and pepper, and some fresh onions to serve. And that's all we need. So on the left we have our dough, then in the middle we got the meat, the sauce and the onions to serve. When it comes to the equipment, a couple of bowls, scales, a dough scraper, temperature probe, a rolling pin, a chopstick or a skewer. This will be used for impressing the lines on top of the dough. And a piping bag would be very useful, although you could survive without it. Now for baking the somun, I'm going to use my baking stone. If you don't have a stone, use something that is thick and solid, like a thick metal tray or cast iron pan. It's always best to bake a bread on a hot base. For the kebabs, I'm going to use my panini press, which is by no means a good option. You could also cook them in a pan, in the oven, but barbecuing would be the best option. So let's start by making the ćevapi mix. Get your stale bread and cover it with cold water. This is an old method that you could also use for making meatballs. We will soak the bread and then we'll press all the water out of it. Adding this to ground meat makes it nice and soft and springy. I always use this method when making meatballs and it works so well. One thing you should never do is add dry breadcrumbs, because they will only absorb moisture from the meat and dry the mix out. So in the bowl I've combined my egg, the paprika, the salt, pepper and the garlic. Now take the bread and squeeze out as much water as possible. And now just break it up and add it to the rest of the ingredients. It's always best to mix all the other ingredients first before adding the meat. That will ensure that everything's dispersed evenly. So once you've added the bread, mash everything together until it's nice and smooth. And only now comes the final ingredients, the pork and the beef. And it's worth noting that you could use different meat. You can use beef and lamb, or just beef and just lamb. I like the mix of pork and beef because you get the flavor from the beef and the juiciness and fattiness from the pork. And this mix would be perfect for making meatballs with, serving up with some tomato sauce. Now if you have a piping bag, I would suggest using it. It makes it really easy to make these kebabs. If you don't have one, it's totally fine. You can shape them by hand. It'll only take you longer. But once you try the piping bag method, you ain't going back, trust me. Now my piping bags are quite massive, so I could fit all the mix at once. You might have to split it in a couple. To make it easier for myself and to avoid making a mess, I like to tie up the end. But that's the mix ready to go. Pretty simple, right? Now comes the party trick of the piping bag. Grab a tray or a plate, cut a nice big hole at the end of the piping bag, get a little knife handy, or something to cut the kebab off with, and simply pipe it on the tray. Go nice and slow, because when you pipe it quicker, it will come out thinner. Although it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. You can make them bigger, you can make them smaller, it's up to you. Once you reach the desired length, simply cut it off. And what would have taken a few minutes to do by hand and be a lot messier, took us 30 seconds with a piping bag. And these are nice and solid, it's not like they're gonna fall apart. So I'll stick them in the fridge for later, and while we're at it, might as well make the sauce. Got the sour cream, the salt and pepper, and the herbs. I'm using chives. You can use other herbs if you like. Mix it all up and leave it in the fridge for later. 5 minutes into the video and only now we're starting to make the dough. It's because it's so simple. Make sure you're using cold water if you're kneading your dough by hand, because as you knead it will warm up quite a lot. So in a large bowl, combine the water, the yeast, the salt, and give it all a good mix. You want to dissolve the salt before you add the flour. Once it's all mixed up, add the flour, grab your scraper and mix it to a dough. You could also make the dough before you make anything else, and whilst it's proofing, make the other elements like the meat and the sauce. That will certainly save you some time, but I wasn't in a rush. So once you mix your dough to a nice cohesive piece, dip it out on the table and we can start kneading. This is not sticky at all, so I'm going to use my regular kneading method here. What I like to do is press down and forwards with the heel of my right hand, then using the fingers of my left hand I fold the piece of dough under the heel of my right hand, and turn it and repeat. Once you've done this few times, the motion will become fluent. And this dough doesn't take long at all, maybe 5 minutes in total. And once it's nice and smooth, we can shape it up, place it in a bowl and take its temperature, and then start proofing. 25 to 26 degrees Celsius, just about right for this. If your dough is warmer, it will ferment more rapidly. If it's cooler, it will take longer. I'll leave it for an hour and a half. Just keep an eye on it. It should double in size. As you can see, it's puffing up nicely. So if your dough is looking like this, now it's time to divide it. And I must stress how simple this recipe is. 4 ingredients, we do only one proof, going straight to the dividing step, pre-shaping, then the final proof, final shape, and baking only takes 3 minutes. You could of course change the recipe, you could make it using a preferment if you wanted to, but I think keeping it simple is quite good for this, because all the other elements of this dish are super simple too. So I don't see a reason to complicate it. So once you divided your dough, flatten it out, fold the edge over the middle, going around in a circle until you reach point where you started. Then flip it smooth side up, tighten it against the table, pick it up, pinch the seam together at the bottom, and that's your round dough ball done. Then continue on with the rest, place them on a tray or on a plate, or leave them on the table if you want, then cover them up and we can leave them for the final proof. Make sure there's enough space between your balls. You could also dust them lightly with flour. My cling film did stick a little bit, but it wasn't the end of the world. The final proof will take around an hour, and during this time preheat your oven, 250 degrees Celsius with a fan on, and also preheat your stone or your pan or whatever you're using. And once your dough balls are puffed up nice and big, we can start rolling them out. So grab your chopstick, your skewer, your rolling pin, and some flour. Now give it a good dusting, because it is a little bit sticky at this point. Now I'm going to start pressing it out by hand and then continuing on with the rolling pin. Although at this point I realized that the rolling pin was not totally necessary, so if you don't have one, you can easily stretch this dough out by hand. Because it doesn't have to be very big at all. Matter of fact, you don't want to roll it too thin. I'll go over just a couple of times with the rolling pin and that'll be enough. This is about the size that you want. Now using a chopstick or a skewer, impress a diamond pattern into the dough. This is the classic look for the Somun bread. And I quite like it, I think it looks pretty cool like that. I'm going to cook mine one by one, but you can certainly put more in the oven at once. They'll take no more than 3 minutes. And once they're puffed up and golden brown all over, they're ready. If you are going to do them one by one, then make sure to keep the other ones in the fridge so they don't over ferment. And as soon as they come out the oven, cover them so they don't dry out. We want to keep them nice and soft and pliable. And look at that, the easiest yeasted bread in the world, I would say. Now there's only one thing left to do, to cook the cevapi. And I'm going to use my panini press, which is not designed for this use. It doesn't have a drain. It did work quite well at the end, but the cleaning of it was a nightmare. But these things will be tasty no matter how you cook them. I'm going to give them about 4 minutes, then flip them around, give them another 4 minutes. And that's about it. That's our last thing done. We got our bread, we got our sauce, we got our kebabs. This was such an easy meal to make. It was so delicious. The cevapi recipe that I wrote down uses 1 kilo of meat. So if you are not too greedy, you can lower the amount. But this will be perfect for 4 very hungry people. Now all we need to do is cut open some flatbreads, add some sauce, add some meat, a little sprinkle of fresh onions, bit of chili flake if you like it hot. And there you have it, Bosnian Somun with cevapi. What do you think of this meal? Is that something you would try? Let me know down in the comments. And if you have any questions or suggestions, also let me know. And do check out the other videos in the Baking World Tour. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.